Position organizing programs here, doing education work at the museum. So this is a really warm welcome, and I just want to say that there are 5 seats that I'm looking at right here. I see some people standing in the back, so if anybody wants a seat, and also if anybody wants to come up here for any latecomers that might want a seat in the back, that would be awesome, so I encourage that. Yeah. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Robert, and really looking forward to hearing about this project of yours and learning more about it. So, welcome, Robert.
Hi. I've been going through this in my mind too many times, so this is like the 300th time that I've been moved to see so many. Not even friends; it's like beyond friends. Yunara and I got here just yesterday, right? No, 2 days ago, and I didn't know that I was going to feel this overwhelmed by being in Tucson. And I hope I'm not being mistaken, but it feels almost like the first time I've ever returned somewhere. And by that I mean there was people to return to and things left unfinished, and so I'm feeling really, really emotional, actually. And it has a lot to do with a lot of people who are here. And it has a lot to do with this museum. Yeah, I don't know, it's difficult to explain like how powerful this space is, and how much it gave me, and how much I feel like I gave to it. And it's changing too, and I think it's moving in really, really important directions. And I'm really humbled by everyone who's working here now, and the people who I started working with here, and people in the community who I brought in, and like Megan, who's here, who's doing amazing education work, and who brought a lot of people from the Autumn community into dialogue with what we're trying to do here. And so this project that I'm going to talk about is inextricable from these feelings. Okay, so I'm just going to start, and I'm going to try to be simple tonight, and not explain things too much. Just say things, which is difficult for me. This has been up for a while, so you had the opportunity to see. So this is my credits to the people, some of the people who were involved in this project. But I really want to point out that all of this presentation is going to be really carried by the photographic work of Nina Berfelde, who's a Berlin visual artist, a Berlin-based visual artist, and who accompanied me throughout this project. And so I really want to honor her in particular right now, because probably the power that, if you experience any power tonight, it will be because of her work. So this performance that I did over the course of 6 months in Berlin is called Lost in Jüdische Friedhof Weißensee. And for those of you who don't know German, Jüdische Friedhof Weißensee means the Jewish cemetery of Weißensee, which is a neighborhood in Berlin, in the former East Berlin. The practice that I brought to the cemetery in Berlin, the Weißensee cemetery in Berlin, was created in the abandoned apartment of my great-grandparents in rural Pennsylvania. When I was in college in Brooklyn, I began to feel the need to touch something of Jewishness that I hadn't touched before. And I felt that I could do that in the store that my grandfather ran, that he took over from his father. And so what I did was I took my typewriter and a bunch of books that I thought were kind of encouraging me to understand Jewishness in a certain way, which was very particular, and it was very much formed by kind of radical poets who were responding to the Holocaust as an event or as a circumstance that must change the way in which something like a poem is composed. And so I went to this small town in Pennsylvania where I partially grew up, and my grandfather was going to work every morning, and I would go into work with him, and I would walk up the stairs behind this curtain into the apartment that he had grown up in, and that his parents left very abruptly. And and I simply sat and walked and experienced the world inside of this space. The roofs were caving in. There were things that were left behind, like salt and record players and baby carriages, and dead birds on the floor. And so what I developed was what I would later call to be a practice of durational contemplation, and in which someone devotes themselves to a site over an extended period of time, and kind of remains lost in it. And that the intention of being there is very abstract, but at the same time very definite. It's rooted in a particular question. And the question that I had when I was in my great-grandparents', the ruins of my great-grandparents' apartment was, what is a Jewish life? What is the materiality of a Jewish life? You know, and this was something that I didn't really know in terms of a familial thread. It was something that I knew as a visitor, someone who could visit a synagogue, you know, someone who could visit a traditional community, you know, but it wasn't something that I knew to be familial necessarily. And this is something that I found in the apartment. It's my grandfather's name is Theodore, and so this was his siddur, or prayer book, when he was a kid, and it's the cover of the prayer book.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Yeah? Because I'll feel a lot better if I'm just talking without this microphone.
I think the recording will be better if you have the mic. Just
Oh, is there a recording?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Either way, whatever's most comfortable for you.
No, it's okay.
We should record it. Although maybe it will be more worth it if I don't use the mic, but I'll try to forget that it's here. And I should also forget about these crazy notes that I have. Okay, so I came to the Jüdische Friedhof Weißensee because my partner told me about it, because her father told her about it, that it was this amazing space. And so I walked in one day a couple of years ago, when I first started working here actually, and the man at the gate it was about to be Shabbat, and the man at the gate was trying to tell me in German, which I still don't speak, that it was closing early, today. And so he was pointing to his clock and saying something, and I didn't really know what he was saying, and I kind of roughly understood that it was closing really soon. And I walked into the cemetery, and I was overwhelmed by this experience of being surrounded by Jewish people in Germany. So I'm in a genocided place, and this is the most populated. Like, this is the only experience of a kind of intimacy of Jewish people, of Jewish things, that I had experienced while being in Germany. And I was writing and I was studying the stones, and you must know that this space is very large. It's the largest intact Jewish cemetery in Europe, actually. There's about 117,000 people buried there and continue to be buried there. I suddenly remembered that I had to keep track of the time, and I had been walking for quite a long time and wandering and wasn't paying any attention to where I was going or the turns that I was making. And then I realized that I was lost and that the cemetery had probably closed, And I basically freaked out, like really viscerally. I was very scared. And I started running, actually. And it was amazing to see the cemetery from the perspective of a running body. And there were things that I wanted to spend time with, And I would run all the way in one direction, and then it would be, it'd be a wall, and it wouldn't be the entrance, And then so run in a different direction, because that was the way in which I was trying to find my way out. And eventually I came to what must be the largest grave in the cemetery, which is this kind of Greek, like, mausoleum. Like, it looks like a Greek temple of this very wealthy industrialist named Ashcroft, and he built it for his wife. And this is inside of the dome. And when I came to outside of this grave, I felt such a feeling of horror that my spine felt like it was a foreign object, like it was metal. This is a feeling that I had before in another Jewish context, in which I went into a Hasidic neighborhood, and we're not talking like Chabad, like the people who would talk to you, like the communities that won't talk to you. That's a long story, but I was in a situation where I was in a Hasidic synagogue, and my spine turned to metal like this, right? So I decided after seeing this grave, I saw the entrance, which is also the exit, and I left. I came back to do this project, and I was funded by the German government and supported by a pretty radical institute for art, interventionist art in Berlin, called the Institute for Art and Context. And so I was able to be here for 6 months under the premise that I was going to be lost in this space for a very long time, and that through this experience of being lost, I was going to compose art actions. I was going to compose some kind of thing that I would do with my body or with other people in order to contribute to this space. Okay. The Russian artist Ilya Kabakov was very influential to my thinking about space, who created the idea of the total installation, has this concept, this very particular concept of lostness. And so for him, a total installation it's an installation that one walks into, and it becomes it becomes the entire space that one is inside of. So this museum is a total installation, actually, because when we're inside of it, it's total. It's completely surrounding us, and we read our bodies, and we read everything that's in here according to the purpose that the space holds. And he talks about the effect of ritual inside of the total installation, that there's this feeling of ritual, and it's nothing that he can do, like with plastic material. Like it's not something that he can do with by hanging a light bulb a certain way, or by building something a certain way, or by putting a certain text or colors or something. It's something kind of indescribable that happens, that when one is inside, one feels a certain kind of spiritual intensity, that one's memory is activated in a very particular way. And that one feels, most importantly, that what one is inside of is absolutely uninhabitable, that you can't stay there. And because you have that experience that you can't stay there, you look for a way out, an escape. But the way out isn't the way you came in. It's actually an escape according to the terms of the total installation. It's an escape that's formed by the experience of being inside it. So the way that what happened to you before you entered, it's not the right tool. It's not going to get you out of what you're in now. You have to find the exit within this new circumstance. And I was really feeling, and it's not that far away. You guys should go. And Brandon Shimoda told me about this, and it really changed my life. But there's a total installation by Ilya Kabakov and Marfa. And I know Marfa is pretty weird, but you should go. It's called School Number 6, and it's amazing. He basically built the ruins of an abandoned Soviet primary school, and he's a Soviet exile. So I was really thinking about the cemetery as a total installation, and as a place in which was uninhabitable to me, which has very, very significant historical implications upon my body as a Jewish person, as an Ashkenazi person, a person of Jew of European descent, who comes from this very particular situation of at once being a white person and then also standing in for the object of colonial race structures and the total eradication that comes out of colonial race structures, right? So I'll say just a little bit about this because a lot of people don't talk about Jewishness in terms of that, and I was trying to do some of that here, and I think it's still happening. But there's you can see it actually over there in the museum. This first stage of the elements of genocide classification, you can see the Nuremberg race laws, which was most directly influenced by the Jim Crow race laws. Okay, and so we know this factually. And you can see it replicating and feeding off of these other, what would be called in colonial territories, casta laws, right? So the breaking down of people according to racial ideology. And so Jews are an internal, an internal subaltern, an internal object of colonial racism, right? And so the Shoah and the Shoah, it can only happen because Europe is invested in colonialism. It doesn't happen without colonialism, period. And so we get to I should stop there. So I'm gonna move on now. Okay. All right. So when I was lost in the cemetery, this is coming together well. When I was lost in the cemetery, I was like, there's a baby in here, but I'm going to say this. What the fuck am I going to do? If I'm stuck in a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery in Berlin, where people who were murdered in the Holocaust are like not buried and also buried here, so this kind of like, typical like Ashkenazi paranoia or something, or experience, I'm going to Germany and suddenly I feel like my body, now here, and I don't know why, and this kind of thing. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to climb out, over the wall and then jump down, from this very high wall, off these crypts, and and it was like, how can I do that? That's so creepy. And then when I land, like all of the Germans who are paranoid about, the desecration of Jewish sites are going to call the police on me, and then they're going to arrest me because I was vandalizing a Jewish cemetery. And so what am I going to tell the police when they arrest me? So this was my escape, actually. This was my escape inside of I feel like a motivational speaker all of a sudden. But
It's the microphone.
it's the microphone. Yeah, it is the microphone. Yeah. And so my grandfather has like a pretty German-sounding name, which is pretty typical for Ashkenazi. And we could talk about Ashkenazi history, and it started in Germany, so that's why our names sound German. But so I was saying in my rudimentary German to the imagined police officer who's arresting me for being a vandal, that my grandfather, Friedhof Sniderman, is buried in the cemetery, and I was trying to find his grave, and I couldn't find it, and then it closed because it's Shabbat, And you can't arrest me for trying to find my grandfather in your fucking genocided city, So, so this is a photo that my grandfather took in Germany or France in 1944 or 1945. And, it's a group of people in the devastated landscape carrying a corpse. And he gave it to me. It's really the last time that I saw him. So he gave this to me with other photos. My second escape, I guess you could call it this, was my father's spleen. My father doesn't have a spleen. He got into an almost fatal car accident when he was about 20, and the spleen was taken out of him because it ruptured in his body. And when he was recuperating over a period of 6 months, that's interesting because I was in the cemetery for 6 months. My great grandmother Sadie, or Sora, her Yiddish name or birth name Sora, took care of him, and because she took care of him, I know a little bit about her. So, like other refugees, so Sora was fleeing a wave of state-sponsored racist mob violence between 1881 and World War I through World War I, in which most of the Ashkenazi population of Eastern Europe fled, to different places, including the United States. And so they didn't, she didn't talk about where she was from, and she didn't speak her language to her children and to her grandchildren. And so she was part of, what I would consider to be a non-consensual process of assimilation due to kind of global structures that want her to take upon a body that's a safer signifier, but that will continue to perpetuate the violence that she endured and that made her flee from a place that she didn't want to flee, which was Warsaw in Poland. And so I know that she was from Warsaw because she took care of my father for 6 months. And that's almost all I know. I know that she was from Warsaw. I know that her father's name was Moshe. I know that she had dirty blonde hair. I know that that she was proud to be Polish, that she was proud to be a Polish Jew, that she was proud of being from Warsaw. And so the spleen, my father's spleen, becomes this empowered catalyst in history, a kind of catalyst of various historical forces in its absence that formulates a lot of the work that I would end up doing in Berlin. This is a part of the cemetery that I found myself in quite early on, and realized that everyone buried in it was a child that died between 1898 and 1907. And I was very, well, I think that's all I have to say. So these are graves for people who were too poor to buy a stone. Traditionally, in Jewish cemeteries, everyone who is buried is supposed to be buried the same way with the same stone, coming from the idea that once you die, you're the same as everyone. Like when people die, there's no class hierarchy in death, and this traditional practice is subverted by the nature of Berlin Jewry, which was probably the most assimilated Jewish population in the world, and is actually the place in which assimilationist Judaism really kind of formed, as not as something that you would leave the Jewish community and then become something else, not that kind of assimilation, but where you start to take the practices so that they directly kind of fit the rationale of the dominant culture. So in this case, German Protestantism. And so some of you who grew up in Reform Judaism or know Reform Judaism, the synagogue next door was built as a Reform Jewish synagogue. So this is part of this history rooted in Berlin, actually. And let's also remember that that's the context in which the power that would conduct the genocide of Europe's European Jewry, the majority of whom were in the East, okay, lived. So, this is from my notebook. Paula was 5, Franny was 5, Astrid was 7, Arthur was 6, Goethe was 2. I walked randomly into a field of buried children. Max was 8, Ludwig was 14, Paul 7, Albert was 8, Margot was 7, Otto was 7, Ella 6 months, Ella 4 months, Harry 7, Nellie was 2 years and 2 days, Rosa was 2 years and 1 month, Carl was 9 months, Michael was 2 years and 3 months, Sophia was 1 day, and buried in 2001. So actually on the edges of this plot were young children who were buried much later in the 2000s. And there's this kind of like solidarity that's formed between the grieving parents in the present or in the contemporary era and this very particular time in Berlin life. David was 3 days, 2008. Nellie Teresa Marcus was 3. Hertha Isaac was 2. Frida Levy was 8 months. Ellen Levy was 2 months. Now, I did cry. You know, you think you're in a cemetery, and like what I'm reading, it's intense, and but my intention. Actually, I have a note here that I began crying at this one particular. David was 3 days, buried in 2008. I began crying, but my intention of spending time in this space was not the intention of mourning. Actually, Felipe. My intention was to ask the most fundamental questions about what does it mean, what does Jewish mean? What is Jewish mean? What is Jewish body? What is Jewish history? What does it mean to be in a collective? What does it mean to be a human being inside a collective? And, you know, one of the things that was really, really plaguing me, which will unravel as I go through, was the way in which Jewish identity takes upon, or I want to say Jewish identities. I'm speaking about this in the singular, and it's totally wrong. It should be in the plural, absolutely. But the way in which Jewish identities contain within themselves the active structures of anti-Semitism. So the Black Studies scholar Fred Moten talks about the diffusion of anti-Blackness as being part of Blackness. So the historical diffusion of anti-Blackness being part of Blackness, right? And he's not saying that like we need to get rid of that or something, but that it's part of it, right? And that one works within that, right? And it sets up a certain kind of critical disposition towards oneself. So this is really when I'm inside of the space, I'm thinking about collectivity. And I'm putting myself into a situation where I'm surrounded by a certain collectivity that's not in the flesh, that's impossible in the flesh, in a place where it's impossible in the flesh, right? People start to be buried in the cemetery in actually around the beginning of the pogrom period that I'm talking about, where in 1881, I won't go into that history, but so it starts in 1882 while Berlin is really blowing up into a major metropolis, and all different segments of the Berlin population is exploding, all different kinds of minorities and people, including Jews, and so this is basically the people who are around during the first burials, you know, possibly were still around during when Nazism started, and during the genocide. So this is a very particular space that's communicating something about Ashkenazi Jewish history, really around the genocide, very particularly. So those people who lived in a kind of assimilationist life, and then those generations who lived during the genocide, and then the people who lived after right? And that population, the nature of that population in terms of class, in terms of where they're coming from in the diaspora, in terms of how they identify themselves, is changing quite radically throughout that time. And that's really inscribed in the space. This is a grave, a hand-carved grave. And the text, you can't really tell that there's these two hands kind of clasped together. And then there's this text. And something that was really interesting to me was the anonymity of the text on the stones. Like, who is saying this? Because as I'm moving through it and as I'm spending all of this, as I said, contemplative time in this space, I'm really taking it as an experience of being communicated to. And so this says, we're going to be together eternally, something like that. And then it's like, who is this we? Who is this other person? This is Georg, And then who is this we? And that's something that's really beautiful, actually. Kind of the abstraction of the way in which the space is communicating, the materiality of the space is communicating. When I was studying the cemetery in the beginning, I was thinking a lot about my spine and my spine becoming a foreign object. And it was continuing to happen, especially in the beginning. And I realized that there's this trope on some of the stones of these two hands, just like that. And it's kind of like the hands of, it's known as like the priestly hands, or the hands that are blessing someone. And I started to think about my spine, what was happening to my spine, as being, that it was being like grasped and kind of like held so tightly by these ancestral hands. And that it was this other kind of blessing, actually. It was this, because the spine is like the structuring core of one's body, of one's life. And I really felt like I was being, that it was being taken from me. I developed actions out of my study of the site as it was happening. I called these the daily perpetuation of unstable laws. And this is me in a field where people were buried. So there was an extremely high number of suicides in Berlin during the mandatory deportations, which started in 1942. And there were, I think, just in 1942 alone, there were over 1,000 suicides. And they were being buried in 42, actually, which says something about this, the culture, like the Jewish culture of Berlin, and that the cemetery specifically represented, because suicide is heretical. But that this cemetery, in its kind of reconfiguration of Jewish traditions, was able to make these concessions to the tradition and enable people who committed suicide to be buried there. But this was a field of people who were buried at night during the mandatory deportations, and then also people who were in hiding after the mandatory deportation. So when there weren't supposed to be Jews in the, alive within within Berlin. And so they were buried in secret in this field. And so I was placing stones in this field. I came to the cemetery on this day with, I think it was 66 stones in my backpack. It was very heavy. And you can see there's a stone in my hand. And I have a memory of my grandmother, walking with my grandmother to my aunt's grave in this town that I mentioned before, where I did this contemplation inside of the ruins of my great-grandparents' apartment. And I developed this practice. And I have this image of my grandmother holding the stone in her hand and walking towards the grave, and then realizing that it was Shabbat, and she's like, "Oh, we're Reformed Jews, it doesn't matter, it's okay." And then, I remembered her doing that, and this placing of stones is also the most visible tradition that you can see within a Jewish cemetery. And because it's this kind of aesthetic intervention of the living, where they're changing the landscape by placing stones on these graves. And one can kind of begin to understand the world's relationship to the buried person through these leavings. I began to form a more complicated relationship to this act, but I'll get to that later. This is another action I did on this day. This is one of several fields of cremated people who were buried there, and this is another heretical act in Jewish tradition that wouldn't normally be allowed a space in a Jewish burial ground, but was in this context. And my grandfather, who took the photo during the war, he was cremated, and I had a really difficult relationship to that. And I did this action where I put a stone on every grave of a cremated person in this particular field. There were about 130 of them, and I did this over the course of the time that I was there. And it was kind of an honorary action to him. He was an abusive person. He didn't identify as being Jewish, even though his parents were Yiddish-speaking refugees. He had also, besides me, he was the last person to be in Europe, after his parents, fled. This is a grave of suicide, a couple who committed suicide in 1942. It's not listed that they committed suicide, but you know that they did because they died on the same day in 1942, which is the year of the mandatory deportation. On May 14th, 66 people were murdered in Gaza. And I was on a train coming from Warsaw. I was the first person to go to Warsaw since my great-grandmother left. So this day was the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, which was the day that, it's not just one day, but it marks the period of time in which around 700,000 Palestinian people were, as of now, permanently exiled from their villages, from their houses, from their communities, and so this is they were marching in what they were calling the Great March of Return, which was advocating for the end of the blockade of Gaza. So the Israeli control over what goes into, including human bodies, into and out of Gaza, which is widely understood as being the largest open-air prison in the world. And they were marching for the right to return to their ancestral places. And I came to Berlin not expecting necessarily to work in Palestine solidarity, in Jewish Palestine solidarity. But that ended up being a huge part of what I did. And it was it came from two places. It was a visceral reaction to the massacre of 66 people in one day, which was part of a string of other massacres that I think went from March to May. And these were nonviolent protesters. They included children, the youngest of which was an 8-month-old infant. And coming from Warsaw, in which my experience was really dominated, which is very difficult to be there and not let it be dominated by this, but the history of the ghetto there. And so one kind of, not unproblematically, wants to make the link between the Warsaw Ghetto and these other processes of ghettoization across Europe in Jewish history to Palestinian ghettos. I had also learned about some of the ghettos that were formed in Palestine directly after the Nakba, particularly through the Israeli Jewish / Christian Palestinian artist Dor Getz. He's an amazing artist. And his family was incarcerated in a ghetto in what's now known as Lod, and was known when before the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Palestinian territories, right? A place that was being cohabited by both, and then creating this system of dual sovereignties instead. Was known as Al-Lod, so almost the same. And his family was incarcerated in that ghetto for, I think it was 3 years. And I didn't know about such ghettos. So I was also, so the other side, so there was the visceral relationship to Gaza. Many Jews, I should say Jews who do not live in Israel, because Jewish Israeli activism or Palestine solidarity activism has an extremely long history in that region. There's been Jewish Palestinian solidarity since the moment that they were living together, which is a very, very long time ago. And within the current circumstances, extremely significant movements and groups and people and collaborations that no one usually talks about in the United States. But I was increasingly angry and of the feeling of being instrumentalized by a certain kind of narrative of what it means to be Jewish in the world today, according to this separation that was constructed in that region. between so-called Arabs and so-called Jews. I really wanted to be able to speak out about what I perceive to be an untenable system, an untenable way of talking about it, and at that time, this changes in my experience in Berlin, but at that time, a really intense reaction to the violence committed there every day, in the occupied territories, but also within the state of Israel itself, to Palestine and Palestine-identified people, Palestinian-identified people. And I wanted to be able to speak about this within Jewish institutions. I wanted to be able to speak about this in my synagogue, and I wanted to be able to speak about this in Jewish museums. And I didn't want it to be erased, and I didn't want to be called anti-Semitic for doing that. And so, like, my exploration in Berlin and the way that it was kind of forming was really coming out of this anger and this rage. And that anger I found to be shared with a lot of Jewish Israelis who live in Berlin, who chose to live in Berlin, a lot of Palestinian people who live in Berlin. And it's an important part of the discourse that's taking place there. And actually right now, there's something very significant happening, which is that the current Israeli administration is trying to get Germany to defund its the Jewish Museum of Berlin because of its current exhibition called Welcome to Jerusalem, which includes Palestinian perspectives of the city. This was spray painted on the wall of the cemetery the day after this massacre of 66 nonviolent protesters in Gaza. On the walls of the second oldest Jewish cemetery in Berlin. This is a cemetery that I think people are buried from the 16th century up until the time that Weißensee opened, so in the late 19th century. It says insurrection. And I think that this is this shows, this points to something that I perceive to be what I would start to work with in Berlin in terms of public actions that I developed out of my study of the cemetery and out of this kind of visceral relationship that I was forming to the space. So after an act of incredible violence, of state violence is committed by an administration that claims to be acting on behalf of and for the safety of the Jewish people, and this is the rhetoric. It wasn't always like that necessarily in Israel, but right now it's particularly heightened, and it has a history since the inception of the idea that there would be a Jewish state, is that the state would act on behalf of all Jewish people around the world. And so when that happens, then walking through a city like Berlin, but I would argue walking anywhere in the world, as a Jew, you become a particular target, a particular kind of target. And this isn't, I would argue that this isn't becoming a target because of the anti-Semitism. It's not purely because of the anti-Semitism that exists within the non-Jewish population or the Jewish population of a particular place. Okay, but it's a kind of target that's being instrumentalized by a state that's working according to state interests. And in this case, they're ethno-national interests that Jews within Israel, outside of Israel, might not identify with. Okay, and so this points to a very particular thread in the history of anti-Semitism, particularly in Berlin, but really kind of all over the world in the modern era, which is that when society or the world is destabilized, that there's a Jewish instrument behind it, that there's a Jewish mind behind it that's orchestrating it. It's not putting its body on the line, but it's behind it. It's kind of making it happen. So the Tree of Life massacre happened because the terrorists who committed that massacre believed that Jews were orchestrating the migrant caravan, which was perceived to be, and this language came directly from the president, was perceived to be an invasion of terrorists on the United States. And so insurrection, or the language of revolution, also has an anti-Semitic thread history to it. The pogroms that sent Jews fleeing the Russian territories, from which my family fled, were committed by people who believed in a kind of revolution, and that the eradication of the Jewish population was part of that in order to take down class hierarchy, And so this inscription of insurrection, I read as being pointed to that, and it's being layered upon the representation of a Jewish history in Berlin, which there are Jews living in Berlin, but this is a really important, places like this, cemeteries, museums, are basically the kind of face of Jewishness. How are we doing on time? Getting late, yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, so this is kind of, so I point to this because these are the politics that I'm walking into, that I'm living within, like between these anti-Semitisms, right? So between an anti-Semitism that's perpetuated by the Jewish state in claiming to speak on behalf of all Jews, and in terms of like needing a very particular Jew to exist in order for its ambitions of ethno-nationalism and ethnic cleansing to take place. And then between this classical instrument of anti-Semitism, which threatens all of us, actually, because it throws my body on top of the caravan, right? And says that there's not actually a refugee crisis in Central America, but it's actually it's because Jews are inherently dangerous and evil. This is a public action that I did where I walked from a former deportation site to the cemetery. It was 17 kilometers, carrying stones that I took with me from Warsaw, with Gaza written on my back in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin alphabets. This is me dropping stones outside of the U.S. Embassy and showing my back to the police officers working outside of it. Across the street is the Holocaust or the major Holocaust monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. I carried the stones like this the entire way. That's a rusted exhaust pipe on my chest. The crematorium were developed from vans that gassed disabled people. And so this is a citation of that technology. And it's also my father's spleen. This is the entrance to the cemetery. It was closed by the time I got there. I'm gonna skip this. This is an Israeli dissident friend who believes in a binational state. And so she would consider herself anti-Zionist. She feels that Jewish nationalism displaced her family from their ancient community in Greece. This is a performance that she did. This is another public action where I'm walking, wearing the same things with stones in front of the Israeli embassy, Berlin, in far west Berlin, and I would walk from there to the Jüdische Friedhof Weißensee. And that's a police officer following me. There would be a van of police officers following me. And I placed stones down on the ground while I was walking. This is a poem that I recited while walking on this walk. And you'll see it's called Spleen. All of this text was written inside of the cemetery. The poem was written the day after the first walk. I'm going to read the poem, and then I'm going to scroll through the rest of the photos and we'll end. In absolute names, the disgust enter like a resurrection of raped things, become breathing, sensuous, gaping, archiving forms. You can call us forms, they say, under, they say, the remnants of a guitar, and of what we've intended for you, you can drink it all in the innumerable massacres ahead, like exhaust in the pipes, mirroring your inhalation. This practice of future states, don't ever name it, they say, your names, but consider what flesh waste spells. In the morning, they say, suffocated, they say, by dreams. This is a Palestinian composer I met who told me that the problem isn't just violence, that it's not just about responding to when violence happened. If there was no violence at all, it would still be a problem. He grew up in Israel as a Palestinian with an Israeli passport. This is the last action that I did. And I handed out this short text in Arabic, German, and English. This Jewish body walks in solidarity with Palestinians' right of return. His ancestors are from eradicated communities of Warszawa, Chisinau, Sarai, and Petrovisk. So I started inside the cemetery this time. These are the cremated graves. That's the police report I submitted. And I was going to walk in front of the Israeli embassy. Once I exited the cemetery, I took off my vest because I didn't feel that I needed to say this to the people who were buried there. This is the largest Palestinian neighborhood in Europe. And as I was walking, people would say to themselves, Gaza, Gaza. And I collected stones while I was walking and tried to carry all of them, so they would drop out a lot. And I ended here. These are the ruins of one of the 3 train stations from which the Jewish population of Berlin was deported. Okay, I'll end there.